Hello everyone, this is Richard here from ZP Productions, and today this is my first part of my basic photography tutorials, and it is on exposure. So firstly, what is exposure? Exposure is the amount of light hitting a medium, and this is exposure in a traditional sense, because exposure is actually made out of two things on the camera, which is the aperture and the shutter speed. So aperture in simple terms is the opening on the lens, while shutter speed is how fast or how much time is allowed for light to hit the sensor. Now, however, in very modern cameras today, ISO, or should I say film speed or sensor amplification, is really part of the camera. It's no longer just a medium like film where you need to swap out. So ISO is also part of this new exposure triangle, and together they form what I call as the brightness of the image, or if you can put in a simple way, exposure of an image. So really, this explains what the different items mean. ISO is sensor amplification, shutter is the amount of time the sensor is exposed in a fraction of a second, and aperture is the size of a lens opening. So normally in cameras, IS go for 100 to 12,800, while shutter speed, depending on your camera itself, some cameras have 1-8000, modern cameras have 1-32,000, all the way to some cameras go even up to 60 minutes. While for aperture, it's quite standard. Most lenses end off at f16 or f32 or f22, while they can usually open up to f1.4, f2, f2.8, depending on the type of lens. So let me show you actually how they look like physically, and also what is ISO on a camera like this. This is the Canon EOS R. And first, let's look at the aperture itself. Okay, now you see this lens. This is a fully open lens. This is a f1.2. It's fully open now. If I press a button to preview, and you can see this is what the aperture is at f2. Notice the amount of area that it closed down. This is about half the area of is wide open, or slightly less than half, because this is a f1.2 lens and this is a f2 opening. So the next thing you will look at is shutter. Now if I off this camera, and you can get to see the mechanical shutter in this camera itself. So this is the EOS R, and this is the mechanical shutter you will see in front of your sensor. All cameras have a mechanical shutter. It's just that EOS R closes the shutter to prevent damage to the sensor. But if not, the shutter's main job is to restrict the amount of light hitting the sensor itself. So if I do on the camera, and let me take a photo here. Oh, I disabled it. Never mind. See? So the shutter opens and closes, and this determines how much light is hitting the sensor. And normally this motion is really quick. It can be like 1 to 6400 or as slow as 3 seconds. It really depends on your settings. So let's put this camera together again. And the last thing we'll look at is the ISO. Most cameras have ISO settings, and that is the sensor amplification. So this is a Canon camera, so ISO, it can be set by just tapping the screen, and you can see 100, 200, 400, 800, 1006. Now it depends on your camera. Some cameras change through dial, some cameras change through touch screen, but on general, most cameras I know that is modern, even phones can do it. You can actually shift the amount of ISO you have to use on your sensor itself. So if we go back to the formula itself, ISO, shutter, and aperture forms the total brightness of an image. Now for me, I separate exposure because exposure, if you read by definition, is really just the physical part, the shutter speed, and the aperture. I will call total brightness as the total exposure on the image itself, if you really want to put it in a simple way. Now, normally when we adjust ISO, shutter, and aperture, we adjust in what we call as a stop. So what is exactly a stop? A stop is just about the double of the previous in terms of amplification, or half the amount of shutter, and therefore double the light, or a bigger lens opening that is twice the area. And it really goes by a stop. And therefore, if you look in a mathematical way, one stop of ISO is can be compensated with 1 minus 1 stop of shutter, or should I say twice the shutter speed. Similarly, 1 stop of ISO increment can also result in an aperture that is smaller, and therefore all this results in the same total brightness. So if you do increase ISO by 1, decrease by shutter by 1, and increase aperture by 1, it is a very simple math, and it results in an image that is 1 stop brighter. Now the thing is the numbers. What does 1 stop actually mean in terms of numbers? So ISO is really straightforward. If you look at the bar below from darkest to the brightest, ISO at the top, ISO 100 is the darkest because it means base ISO, and normally there is no amplification done. And then you increase to 200, 400, and really if you look at numbers, it is 2 times, 4 times, 8 times. Or if you want to look comparatively, 1 stop, 200 to 400 is twice the amount, and 100 to 200 is twice the amount, while ISO 400 is 4 times of 100. And then if you look at shutter speed is in terms of fraction of time. So 1-6400 and 1-3200 is twice the amount of light, but it also means half the speed. And 1/1600 is 4 times the amount of light of 1/6400 and 2 times the amount of light of 1/3200, because you know it is opening the shutter 4 times longer. Now aperture, as I say, is the area of the lens opening itself. So it's actually a fraction. You are dividing the diameter of the lens by the whatever f-stop it is. So f16, what it means is take the diameter divided by 16, and that is the size of the hole. And f1.4 is the same thing, diameter of the lens divided by 1.4, and that's the size of the lens opening. So in this case, it's not so straightforward in terms of numbers. f16 is, let's say, the darkest, and then f11 is twice as bright, and f8 is 4 times brighter than f16 and twice the brightness of f11. So aperture is the only thing you probably need to memorize a little bit, or if your lens has aperture ring, good. Or you know, if your lens has a jump, and then you can see usually they say by 3, 1/3 of a stop, and 3 jumps equal to 1 stop. So you just get used to it, because aperture is not as straightforward in terms of numbers compared to shutter and ISO. So let us look at a demonstration using a real camera, and what I mean by it's really a simple mathematics calculation. So manual exposure, a lot of people fear manual, and really manual is nothing because it is just a very simple maths. So let's look at this again, and let's go here. We'll focus on the image here. Now let's take a shot. This setting, as you can see, is 200 f2 ISO 800. I'm not sure you can see. Let me move this camera again. Let me take one more shot again. 200 f2 ISO 800. So as I say, it's maths. So you know, if I decrease ISO by half to 400, right? And then I change shutter speed to, you know, half this amount. Okay. What I'm doing is that I just lower the amplification of the sensor by half, and then I lower the shutter speed by half, and therefore increasing the amount of light hitting the sensor by 2 times. And now I take a shot again. Now if I look at the image of this, which is 1/100 in terms of shutter speed, f2 and ISO 400, ignore the blinkers. The blinkers mean that these areas of the image are overexposed. Now if I just press left, which is the previous image, notice you can't even tell the difference between the image. They look identical, really identical, because you know, exposure is really a number game, and it is really a mathematics calculation. As long as you know that increasing 1 stop in somewhere and decreasing 1 stop in somewhere, you can get equivalent image of equivalent brightness across the image itself. So what happens if you know, let's say I remember we talked about the aperture. If I now decrease the aperture by 1 stop, I get the image twice as bright. So if I press play again, this image is twice as bright as the previous 2 images. See? Simple as that. It's really purely mathematics. And really, modern mirrorless cameras are really good because they have this ability to preview this exposure. In terms of Canon, what they call it as exposure simulation, and once you enable it, if you change the setting, you really get to see live how this setting looks like. Different camera makers call them different things. Exposure simulation, constant preview, I don't know, exposure viewing. It really depends on the manufacturer. Just look at your camera and maybe you'll get the information itself. Okay, so that being said, there's of course rules of thumb on what you should set for your cameras. Because firstly we talk about ISO. As ISO is sensor amplification, it's like any other amplification technology out there. So if you have used any headphones, earphones or speakers before, if you amplify it louder, you get noise or what is crackling in the sound. Similarly for images, if you increase the ISO too high, you'll get these speckles of white, red and blue, and that is noise in the digital term for sensors. So similarly for shutter, so what is shutter for? Shutter is the amount of time opening and closing, and therefore it determines how sharp an image is as a pixel level. So if you want something really sharp, you will try to increase the shutter speed as much as possible. This will allow you to freeze motion, get sharp images, and really, you know, it controls whether you want to have any motion at all on the image itself. So as a rule of thumb also, shutter you want to try to get as high as possible, because when you have high shutter speed, you maximize your sensor and lens and get the sharpest image possible. Now that is of course not always the truth, because it depends on what you do. Sometimes you do flash photography, sometimes you do automotive. You may want to keep shutter at a certain speed. And also now there's technology such as image stabilization, which allows you to shoot with lower shutter speed and still get very sharp results. Lastly is aperture. Now, aperture is the size of the lens opening. And you know, a lot of people like to use prime lens. We have very big apertures like f1.4. What it means that the lens opening is huge. And that will give you this very nice blur effect called bokeh. Now, bokeh is the effect, while what you really are talking about in terms of, you know, aperture is that of field. Or in simple way, what is being in focused. So at f1.4, only the subject that you are focusing on will be in focus, while at f16, normally everything or most things will be in focus in the frame. Now, people who use f16 are like landscape artists, and people who use f1.4 are like portrait photographers. So, no, aperture is really based on your needs, and more often than not, is an artistic decision. So, if you ask me how do I set my exposure, normally I start from aperture, then I go to shutter, then I go to ISO. But if I shoot in the studio, it'll be the opposite. I'll go for aperture, ISO, and shutter. It really depends on your personal preference. For me, I always start with aperture first, because aperture is really the thing that determines what is sharp and what is not. It is an artistic direction, and I always start that first. So if you, in conclusion, ISO, shutter, and aperture determines the total brightness of an image. And the shutter and aperture is actually the traditional exposure, but in modern exposure, it's actually all these three elements together that forms the total brightness. I hope you enjoy this very basic, photography tutorial that I have. And if you like it, just do subscribe and follow, because I'll be releasing the next one, which is called measuring light. So what is measuring light? Just a preview. Your camera can actually measure the brightness of an image. Your eyes can also measure the brightness of image. There are also specialized tools like light meter. Now, why do they exist? Why do light meter exist when your eyes can eyeball it? Because our eyes are not always the most reliable tool. And therefore, we need to measure to get perfect exposure. So that will be my next tutorial. I hope you enjoy this, and see you next time.